climate change is a human rights issue rather than a scientific or a political or an economic issue?
It is both. It is, of course, a scientific, technical, environmental, political, economic, security issue, but it's also a human rights issue, mainly because the impacts of climate change, not only but in particular on developing countries, are affecting the right to food, the right to shelter, and many other human rights. The IPCC report doesn't put the impacts in those terms, but you can certainly look through a human rights lens and see that this is having great implications on human rights.
And why does the UN process not acknowledge that, you think?
Because the contexts within human rights are being discussed in the context within which climate change, or the policy context, are very, very separate. And it's only due to the work of Mary Robinson, of some UN organizations and Oxfam and WWF that we start seeing the linkages between the two. Hopefully it's not too late, but we as the Stockholm Environment Institute, we are not an advocacy group, we're a research policy analysis group. We certainly believe that there is some potential in looking at the two policy regimes together.
What mechanisms are available to you if you look at it through the human rights lens that are not available if you're simply talking about adaptation? You talked about your frustration with the failure to get adaptation underway.
Right.
What's available if you look at it as a human right?
At the moment, when particularly about adaptation funding, most of it so far has been, the money has been raised so far through voluntary contributions. At the moment, with the Adaptation Fund, we're starting to make an effort to use the carbon market to create, to generate money. At the same time, we also know that this is by far not going to be enough to cover the impacts that are foreseen in developing countries. Human rights law has internationally obligations to avoid harm done by one country, or to compensate harm in one country on another, and this is one mechanism by which adaptation funding could at least be explored to become more of a compulsory component of climate policy rather than a voluntary one. And it's my view personally that developing countries really shouldn't have to rely on voluntary funds to address impacts that really are not of their own doing. The polluter pays principle is well enshrined in international environmental law. It's not being applied in climate change, or at least it's not being referred to very clearly in climate change. There are equivalents in human rights law as well, and we would like to explore what the possibilities are to make sure that a Copenhagen Agreement is stronger than what we are now expecting.
How much, though, is this a rhetorical effort? It's quite easy to declare rights. It's very difficult to build mechanisms to defend those rights, and the world is full of them.
That's very true. There is nobody is against human rights, and in a way that's a good thing, because it makes people buy into what we've got to say more easily. At the same time, it also makes it more difficult, because those countries that would stand to that have their human rights impacted by climate change may not necessarily be the best in domestically when it comes to protecting human rights for their citizens. So yes, if this is to become a political issue that is negotiated within the climate change context, I would expect quite difficult negotiations, but also the formation of coalitions that is quite different from the coalitions we are seeing now traditionally in the climate change context. The geopolitics of climate negotiations could be different, but I agree with you that it's at the moment it's very much a rhetorical issue, but not only. I think Oxfam has done a very good and interesting study, WWF, on the need for compensation. We are starting to look at the legal aspects and finding that there are indeed possibilities in international law to go beyond the rhetoric.
These negotiations are already extraordinarily complex, moving very slowly, not quite delivering. Isn't this just another complication?
Absolutely. But the world is complicated. The question is, if by keeping it simple we can actually solve such a complex problem. On the other hand, by adding this dimension, by adding a dimension that's already well enshrined in international law, much more so than climate change, we might also be able to raise the attention of other policymakers in national governments that are then going to be convinced of the need to address climate change, and perhaps generate a different negotiation dynamics, not necessarily one that's more complicated, but one that is much more clear about the need to protect human rights through climate change protection.
But there are countries that are notoriously sensitive to discussion by other countries of their human rights record.
Yes.
They're not going to be on your side, are they? China, for instance.
We have yet to see what is going to happen. As part of, in the Stockholm Environment Institute, we have hired a lawyer who is going to look into these issues. It's easy to say that there will be a stalemate or a deadlock because of certain countries' positions on human rights, China being one of them, and we would like to look into that in more detail and also see whether there are ways in which they can still be drawn into a coalition that looks at least the international dimension of human rights. We don't have the answer yet. Hopefully in Copenhagen we'll know more.
What do you expect to come out of Poznan?
I think the United Nations have two ways of describing the outcome of these negotiations. They're either successful or very successful. I think these ones